What's actually going on?
We're definitely in the middle of a war of ideas.
The feminists and the gender study types, they I think sincerely believe that they are making the world better with their campaigns and their struggles.
You don't make the world better by pushing collectivist doctrines. You don't make the world better by assigning guilt to people on the basis of their group.
What do you think about, Iceland recently became the world's first nation to make it mandatory for companies and institutions with more than 25 employees to prove that they pay men and women equally for the same
Well,
job.
the first thing I would say is that violates the presumption of innocence.
It feels like there's a lot of steering in Western society now.
A lot of
steering up. Something is frying underneath. And
yes, definitely.
Are we on a brink of cultural war, or are we in the middle of one? Or what's actually going on?
We're definitely in the middle of a war of ideas. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and it's not a political war. It's not even a philosophical war. It's actually, I think, it's closer to a theological war. And what's being questioned is the primacy of the individual. Mm-hmm. It's being deeply attacked, and that attack is really being led by the universities. And the attackers are subsidized by the state and by ever accelerating tuition fees. And how that will play itself out is difficult to say. I mean, the danger is that we'll produce a plethora of radicals on the left and a plethora of radicals on the right, both playing a collectivist game, because the radical right-wingers play the same game, except the radical left-wingers use guilt to bring down the dominant power hierarchy, let's say, guilt and accusations of oppression. But the right-wingers basically say, look, we'll play the same collectivist game, but don't be thinking we're going to play to lose. Yeah, if we're going to be our race or we're going to be our gender, then we're going to play to win. That's exactly right. And I think that both of those ways of conceptualizing the world are deeply flawed. And the danger is that will fragment into those polarized groups, and that'll produce the same long-term consequences that played themselves out in the 20th century. I don't think that will happen. I think that people will come to their senses. I think the universities have made so many mistakes that their overall survival in unchanged form is highly unlikely over the next 10 years. I think
the overall survival of the universities?
Yes. Well, there's already, what would you call, prognostications that up to 30% of American universities and colleges will fail financially in the next 10 years. And partly because they're making so many mistakes. Tuition fees have gone completely off the rails. They're way above, their rate of increase is way above the inflation rate. They're administratively top-heavy. The ethics committees are strangling research. They're gerrymandering their accreditation processes. Students in the United States take out student loans and essentially mortgage their futures, and then they can't declare bankruptcy, so they're basically led into indentured servitude. The incremental economic utility of a university degree is declining, especially if you control for IQ, because, smarter people tend to go to university, so they make more money. You say, well, is it because they went to university or because they're smarter? And most of the evidence suggests it's because they're smarter, not because they went to university. So the incremental economic utility of a university degree is starting to become questionable.
I see.
And that's a lot of mistakes.
And you can learn everything on YouTube now.
Well, there's that too, is that there's other mechanisms of education that are going to be far cheaper, that are going to be tremendously competitive in the next 10 years. And so I think the universities are going to do themselves in.
But you talk of activist studies, women's studies, gender studies, and the feminists and the gender study types, they I think sincerely believe that they are making the world better with their campaigns and their struggles.
You don't make the world better by pushing collectivist doctrines. You don't make the world better by assigning guilt to people on the basis of their group.
But do you believe that
white
they
privilege
believe
is a good example?
No, they're on the right way?
No, I don't believe that. I don't believe, because one of the things I've been doing, I was asked to write the preface for Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago for the 50th anniversary edition, which was a great honor. And so I've been writing that preface. And one of the things I've been trying to figure out is, why the hell did good intentions go so wrong in the Soviet Union? And the answer to that is complex, but part of it is, well, don't be thinking that all the intentions were good. You know, it's like when you stand up for the poor, it's always possible that you're standing up against the successful. It's like, well, what makes you think your motivations are so pure? You think you're just motivated by love and compassion, eh? It's like, where's all the hatred and the aggression? Well, I don't have any of that. It's like, oh, yes, you do. And if you think that love, in your case, is a more powerful force than hate, you might want to think again. And if you look at what happened, the Russian Revolution became bloody and murderous instantly. And what happened was, you know, it was predicated on the idea of the class warfare, which is no different than the victim-victimizer narrative that's being put forward today. Well, the idea of who the oppressor was just grew without boundary. And so they rounded up the students, they rounded up the religious people, they rounded up the socialists and killed all of them, by the way. Because the truth of the matter is that every person is an oppressor and is oppressed at the same time. And so if you take any given person, you can come up with a reason why they're part of the victimizer class. Maybe they're attractive, maybe they're educated, maybe they're intelligent, maybe their parents were reasonably well off, maybe they're white, maybe they're male. Like, you can find you can find some manner in which they're participating in oppression. And as soon as you do that, you can identify them as criminal.
And you see a parallel with the Soviet Union revolution and what's happening today.
Well, I see a parallel between the doctrines that drove the Soviet Union into the ground and the doctrines that the activist disciplines are promoting. They're the same doctrines. It's not. And I certainly see that. And Jonathan Haidt has done a very good job with his Heterodox Academy at documenting the fact that there's no mainstream liberal or conservative voices especially in the activist disciplines, but really in the social sciences and humanities as a whole. And this victimizer narrative and the identity politics frame of reference is the dominant frame of reference. And so, yes, I see them as, they seem to be the same thing. Well, they're certainly left-wing perspectives. They're radical left-wing perspectives. It's like, well, how is that different than these original radical, except it's not, it's still economic class to some degree, but that's been subsumed by the identity politics overlay, but it's the same basic narrative.
And I mean, this has been building up in the university since you talk about the French intellectuals in the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
And why hasn't anyone pointed this out sooner?
Oh, they have. I mean, oh, sure. I mean, there was a real rise in political correctness in the early 90s. But I think what happened was, because I was in the United States when that was happening, and I think what happened was the internet revolution took off and the American economy just boomed. And because the economy was booming, because there were so many opportunities, the whole political controversy just sort of
pulled the teeth out of it.
Yeah, it just calmed down, and everybody thought, well, it was put back where it should be. But over the last 5 years, it's like, and it's hard to tell exactly why. I think maybe it hit a tipping point again. There's been enough radical activists produced and supported by the universities so that things are tipping hard in that direction. You see that playing itself out in human resources departments in corporations, because it's the human resources departments that tend to be the places where the social justice activists aggregate inside corporations, and they're, you know, pushing their diversity, inclusivity, and equity doctrines very hard within corporations. And, you know, the activist disciplines, they train people to go out and infiltrate, is the proper word, all sorts of organizations and bring them into the politically correct domain of operation with the politically correct conceptualizations. They don't make any secret of that.
No, so they state it on their websites.
They state it on their websites, yeah. It's not like I'm inventing activist disciplines. They state very forthrightly that their role is to serve as a counter to the oppressive patriarchy. It's like, okay, really, that's what our societies are they? They're oppressive patriarchies. Really? Compared to what? Countries in the rest of the world? Or countries and states by historical standards? They're actually the freest, most productive societies that have ever existed anywhere, and they're getting better very rapidly. And if that's your definition of oppressive patriarchy, then well, then you're either motivated by motivations you don't want to admit to, or you're so historically ignorant that it's a kind of crime.
What do you think about, I mean, Iceland recently became the world's first nation to make it mandatory for companies and institutions with more than 25 employees to prove that they pay men and women equally for the same
Well,
job.
the first thing I would say is that violates the presumption of innocence. You're not supposed to prove your innocence. And it's a very bad precedent to lay down. And we are losing the presumption of innocence. Like the whole idea of group guilt is the demolition of the presumption of individual innocence. They're the same thing.
We've had the equal pay law since 1976, but now they're supposed to prove it.
Right. Well, the other thing that's happening is that, first of all, there are many reasons for the gender pay gap. And perhaps some of those reasons should be addressed. So the most fundamental reason for the gender pay gap isn't gender. It's motherhood. And that's not the same thing. So it's clearly the case that women take a hit in their salaries once they decide to be mothers. Now, it's conceivable that that's something that society should address, although we don't know how to address it. So, but, you know, you could say, well, that's...
But we have paternity leave, but it still doesn't flatten it out.
No, it's because these things are far more complex than the ideologues insist, because they say, well, there's a gender pay gap. And the reason for the gender pay gap is that men are oppressing women. It's like, well, no. A reason for the gender pay gap might be that there's some residual prejudice. But there are many other factors at play. So here's a couple of them. Men work longer hours than women on average. Okay, so if you work 14% longer hours, that produces a 40% increment in pay. It's nonlinear. Men work in dangerous jobs. Men are more likely to move. Well, that's three. There's more reasons than that men make more money than women. But those are three reasons. Men are less agreeable, and agreeable people make less money too because they're not as effective at negotiating on their own behalf. Men tend to aggregate in enterprises, in occupations that scale. So, for example, if you're interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the STEM fields. You're also in domains where you can scale your operations. If you're involved in the care of individuals, which is something that women's interests tilt them towards, it's much more difficult to scale those enterprises. So it's harder to generate large pools of capital around them. And you might say, well, the only reason that there aren't more women in the STEM disciplines is because of patriarchal oppression. But the data indicate very clearly that as you make your societies more egalitarian, fewer women choose STEM fields, not more. So, because there's also this idea that the only reason that men and women choose different occupations is because of social pressure. But the data, the psychological data, show that that's actually a false claim, because as you make your societies more egalitarian, men and women become more different rather than more the same. And so the social constructionists, the politically correct types, they have no idea what to do with that data, so they just call it, well, it's pseudoscience. It's like, no, actually, it's mainstream psychological research conducted by people who are overwhelmingly left-leaning.
You mean the personality science?
The personality.
The 5 personality traits.
That's right. That's part of that, and the differences in interest, but it's also epidemiological studies of occupational choice.
And it's not disputed that men are less agreeable.
No, it's not. Well, here's not only is it not disputed, it's self-evident. So here's an example. There are about 10 times as many men incarcerated as women, and they tend to be incarcerated for one variant of violence or another. The best predictor of incarceration, the best personality predictor, although it's a weak predictor, is low agreeableness. Okay, so now, on average, men and women aren't that much different in aggression. So, for example, if you take a random woman and a random man out of the population, and you say you had to bet on who was most aggressive, if you bet on the woman, you'd be right 40% of the time, which is actually quite a lot. It's not a huge deviation from 50-50. But if you go out to the extremes and you say, okay, well, fair enough, but if you take the most aggressive person out of 50, and you had to bet on whether they were male or female, you'd always bet male, and you'd be right like 90% of the time. And the only people you incarcerate are the most aggressive people, and they're all men. Well, you look at something like engineering, men and women's interests differ in aggregate, women are more interested in people and men are more interested in things, comparatively speaking. At the mid-range, that doesn't matter that much. But if you pick the 1 in 50 people who are most interested in things, they're almost all men. Well, they become engineers. It's not like everyone's an engineer. Hardly anyone's an engineer. And most engineers are male. And they're the males who are most interested in things. And that's partly why you have all these jokes about engineers. It's like, well, they're socially awkward. It's like, well, yeah, their domain isn't people. Their domain is things. So
these differences that you're talking about, the gender differences, they seem to be a huge taboo.
Yeah, well,
people don't want to hear it.
No, it's a very strange thing, because you might say, well, let's say that you're in favor of the emancipation of the sexes. It's like, well, you should want to hear it. It's like, leave people be so they can make their free choices. Now, it turns out that they're going to make choices that are gendered to some degree, and perhaps that's as it should be. But the idea that you have to impose homogeneity on everyone in the name of freeing them from oppression is an absolutely absurd proposition.